Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I just want to ask the panel a very specific question concerning the subsurface oil plumes that we've been hearing through the news. It seems to me that it goes against all logic. If oil is lighter than water, it should float up to the surface. So why are we having the problem of subsurface? Is that part of the dispersants that's being used that somehow make this oil heavier than water?
I can take the first part of that question and look at it from both surface and subsurface. If you're looking at the injection of subsurface dispersants, I think it was rightly brought up that we don't know all we need to know at depth. However, a lot on the oil will rise. Even dispersed oil will rise. It will rise at a slower rate the smaller the micronic size. So if you have a very small particle, it may take a very long time to get to the surface. If you don't treat it at all, the majority of that oil comes up in about 3 hours. So even if you never disperse the oil, small particles of oil break off, and it's our estimate that maybe somewhere between 30 and 50% of the oil that's emanating from the bottom already disperses in the water column before it gets to the surface, whether you've added any chemicals or not to it. So when you add the addition of subsurface dispersants, you are accentuating that issue and putting in there. But ultimately, those oil particles will start to rise to the surface. However, if they're small enough, may be carried by subsea currents in a particular way. What we're trying to do is map that three-dimensional picture out the best we can to determine at what level they are. Even if they're not visible, is there a detection, and how far away from the wellhead source is that detection?
Now, my next question is to you again, Mr. Westerholm, and to Ms. Leiter. I would like to know what are your respective agencies' plans, the long-term plans, with respect to the recovery of the Gulf Coast. I guess what would be your role in the long-term recovery plan?
I guess I'll speak first on it, and I would divide that into a couple sections. One is the natural resource damage assessment process that we talked about, and Ms. Leiter will also talk about that issue and how that damage assessment will be used to restore the environment to the pre-spill conditions. The other part, though, and part of our long-term plans, is looking at the economic impact from the Department of Commerce and the fisheries, which I spoke of earlier. So there's a fisheries seafood safety impact that has to be considered independent of the natural resource damage assessment process.
Yes, I want to point out that BP, as the responsible party, is responsible not just for long-term restoration costs, but also for immediate response. And part of the immediate response that we're looking at right now is, what are we going to do about the birds, the migratory birds that are coming back in the fall? How are we going to divert them from heavily oiled areas? What are we going to do about the wildlife, the fish and the wildlife that is suffering right now? And how are we going to prevent further damage? And that's part of removal response under the Oil Pollution Act. That is a covered expense that BP should be responsible for.
I understand, but
And so-
can the government participate to expedite this recovery
yes.
process and just hand them the bill and ask them to reimburse you all for it?
Oh, yes. The government can come up with what the removal action should be, can go to the Coast Guard and say, this is what we want to do, this is what we need to do, and we want the fund to pay for it, in which case the Coast Guard then decides if it's an appropriate response cost, gives us the money, and bills BP for the cost. So that's separate from the natural resource damage assessment process. We are a trustee in that process. The state of Louisiana is a trustee in that process. And BP will also be responsible for the long-term restoration of what's been damaged.
My next question is to Secretary Barham. Do you believe that I know that the governor and the parish presidents are pushing for a system of 24 berms being built. Right now, the Coast Guard has approved the construction of 6 of them. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And based on your assessment of the success with respect to the berms, should we go ahead and push for the construction of the remaining berms that right now are not yet been approved?
Absolutely, we should. It's the first line of defense for oil that's coming ashore. It's much easier to clean. You can clean oil from a hard surface much easier than you can from a marsh environment. It's almost impossible in a marsh environment to clean. Beyond that, it also will mitigate the damage of a tropical storm or a hurricane as far as storm surge and carrying this oil into the marshes and the habitat that these migratory waterfowl use and other creatures along the coast. So absolutely we're pushing for the continuation of the construction of these berms.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. That's all the questions I have, and thank you for allowing me to participate in this hearing.